Hello and welcome to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies and Religion here at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. We're thrilled to have you with us today. And I will not be introducing the program about to start, but I will, first of all, like to extend our welcome from the center and from PSR to Dr. Ish Ruiz, who is our new coordinator of the Latinx Roundtable. Dr. Ruiz joined us in July, and today is the beginning of programming for the Latinx Roundtable. Very briefly, in terms of housekeeping, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our socials after this event. We will not capture the chat feature, but we will capture the rest of the program. And so, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Amy Toby, who is a Pacific School of Religion student and a student intern with our Latinx Roundtable. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Latinx Roundtable's discussion. I'm an MDiv student here and an intern for the Latinx Roundtable. I'm delighted to be your moderator today. Pacific School of Religion is a progressive, multi-denominational seminary and center for social justice that prepares spiritually rooted leaders to work for the well-being of all people located in Berkeley, California. The establishment of the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion at PSR marked a significant step in PSR's commitment to justice for all of God's children. The CLGS mission is to advance the well-being of lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and transgender people, and to transform faith communities and the wider society by taking a leading role in shaping public discourse on religion, gender identity, and sexuality through education, research, community building, and advocacy. They do this by providing a certificate in sexuality and religion through PSR's stackable degree program, events, and of course, the work of the roundtables. The Latinx Roundtable is called to build a world where all persons, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, or religious spiritual affiliation, can flourish and live a life of dignity. LRT is committed to serving as a space where we can critically reflect on the theological, political, cultural, and spiritual insights located at the intersection of queerness, Latinidad, and faith spirituality. We dream of a world where queer Latinx spiritual perspectives take active leadership in the journey toward what Christians refer to as the kingdom of God, a utopic eschatological vision where all persons can thrive. I am honored to introduce our panelists for today's discussion on Gente, celebrating our queer Latinx heritage as we kick off Latinx Heritage Month. Each panelist has helped me to rediscover my Latinx heritage, and I know they will inspire you too. So first, we have Dr. Ish Ruiz, the Assistant Professor of Latinx Queer Decolonial Theology at PSR and the coordinator of the Latinx Roundtable. As a Puerto Rican queer Catholic theologian, his research intersects Latinx theology, queer theology, sexual ethics, human rights, Catholic theology, moral theology, education, and social justice. He really likes theology. Dr. Alexandra Rosado-Román is the Assistant Professor of Gender Studies and Caribbean Decolonial Ethics at PSR. She is a social ethicist whose research intersects feminist decolonial theory, diaspora studies, and spirituality. A scholar activist, she is deeply committed to unraveling the intricate workings of colonial social constructs, such as race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and citizenship, and their enduring impact on the lives of racialized women in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. Reverend David Vásquez-Levy serves as the president of PSR and a professor of homiletics. A committed pastor, a nationally recognized higher education and immigration leader, and a sought-after speaker, Vásquez-Levy leads at the intersection of faith, higher education, and social change. We are delighted to have all of you here today. So Each one of our panelists will be invited to answer the following question. In the context of our event today, can you share some insights about your personal identity? And based on that, how do you make sense of the three-way intersection of Latinidad, queerness, and faith? After that, I'll invite panelists to discuss among themselves what's something that they heard from each of their colleagues that they want to respond to. We will have a Q&A section at the end of their discussion. We will be using the chat function for questions to not interrupt our panelists' train of thought. I encourage you to put in questions whenever you have them. So we're going to start our conversation with Dr. Ish, followed by Dr. Rosado-Román, and then President David. So Dr. Ish, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Happy Hispanic Heritage Month. And thank you for being here on this important conversation. So yeah, when I think about my personal identity and that three-way intersection, I do come to this conversation as a queer Puerto Rican Catholic. And when I reflect on that intersection, the word that comes, or the concept that comes to my mind is always double-edged sword. On the one hand, occupying these three spaces was very painful, because I always felt, as Latinos say, we have this term that we use. We say ni de aquí ni de allá. We tend to say I belong neither here nor there. We have this feeling of like not fully being or belonging in one place, and that piece is painful. I grew up as a Puerto Rican on the island, and my coming out process meant that I was suddenly disenfranchised from my family, which is my connection to my culture, but also my faith. And then moving to the States as a Puerto Rican meant that the type of Catholicism that I was used to was very different than the type of Catholicism I experienced, for example, in the Midwest. So again, I had because of the faith that I experienced in the Midwest, my culture was now, I was being disenfranchised in other ways, right? And of course, being a gay man means that I occupy a lot of spaces that are white and male, gay, white, male. And so my brownness and also my Catholicism is not necessarily very accepted in many queer spaces. So there's this feeling of not really fully belonging in any of these three categories because of the other categories. And so that was very painful. However, I went through this process in my life of what I call deconstruction and reconstruction. I really had to examine each one of these identities. What does it mean to me to be gay? What does it mean for me to be Puerto Rican? What does it mean for me to be Catholic? What are they? I'll use a contemporary term. What are some of the toxic traits of each one of these identities that were embedded in me as I grew up? This idea that that Catholicism, for example, we often reject the body in favor of something higher. What about in queerness? That in queer culture, there's a very anti-religious sentiment. In Puerto Rican culture, there might be a lot of machismo, and so I had to really examine each component of these and really do a lot of like discerning and what I call deconstruction, really breaking these down and reconstituting my identity as a gay Puerto Rican man, not necessarily as a disintegrated person, right? And that process took a lot of years. I still think it's underway, very much so. I'm still constantly learning about it. But what it did is it gave me a new perspective and a new sense of energy. I had this suddenly I found myself having this new energy. My queerness was not just queer, it was also fueled by my Puerto Ricanness and my Catholicism, my faith, but also a part of my Puerto Rican identity involves, this awareness of colony and this drive to decolonize, to free, to self-actualize, to liberate, right? And so my queerness got infused with that, but also my Puerto Ricanness got infused with queerness, where I was now able to observe and challenge some of the underlying norms, especially physical ones. So overall, that process of deconstruction and reconstruction gave me a new way of looking at the world, of looking at myself and looking at the world. I'll call this an epistemology. And so for me, queerness, Latinidad, and Catholicism became more than just who I am, but rather turned into a way of seeing the world, an epistemological vantage point. And that also applies to God. I learned a lot of, I do like theology. I did learn a lot about God and who is God? Is God this oppressive, Eurocentric lawgiver, top down, detached from the world and disembodied? Or is God much more of a, a queer, brown, liberatory, loving force? That's the God I fell in love with as I learned how to fall in love with myself, all components of myself as an integrated person. And with that, I'll before turning it over to Rosado-Román, I want to really re-emphasize or underscore the idea of epistemology, because queerness is not just this identity, something that we identify with. Neither is necessarily Latinidad and our spirituality, but it's a way of looking at the world. And because of that, it gives us the ability to invite others to do so. In the same way I can take, for example, a Black theology class and learn to engage in the Black epistemology. Many folks, including our panelists who do not identify as LGBTQ, can access a queer epistemology, a queer way of looking at the world, and apply it to their work academically, politically, etc. With that, I'll stop and turn it over to my fellow Boricua, Alexandra Rosado-Román.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alexandra Rosado-Román. I reflect about myself as a Puerto Rican, of course, as an Afro-descendant, as an Antillean, Caribbean, full Latin American woman, right? However, here in the US, I'm just a Hispanic woman. So sometimes it's a contended category that I wrestle with. Actually, I wrestle with all of those that I have mentioned and others, because as Dr. H commented, we're always self-actualizing ourselves in that way. I was born in Puerto Rico, a non-territory. I hold a US citizenship while also existing as a colonized subject from the US. So this duality of citizenship and colonization has guided my personal and collective vocation in life and has profoundly affected my pursuit of justice, my search for alternative modes of spiritualities, and my efforts to redefine and nurture my creativity. Also to reflect how can I be part of those people who are brilliant, that use their creativity to develop like concrete practices, right? That not also improve present, but also future generations. And in doing so, I have consistently tried my best, and I can always do better, right? To queer my surrounding normative moral values and ethical imperative, my practices, and my spirituality as well. I just want to share 3 quick quotes. 2 are from Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, and 1 is from Chicana writer Gloria Anzaldúa. Freire said, the practice of critical thinking involves a dynamic and dialectical movement between doing and reflecting in doing. And he also said, you can be a teacher, you can't be a teacher without exposing who you are. And we are full of biases due to an education that follow the imperialistic way ingrained in status quo. So those two quotes help me to acknowledge that I'm always trying to reframe myself, assess my practices, trying to deconstruct and decolonize my practices that are so much ingrained in my being. And the next one is Gloria Anzaldúa, and she said, you must, like the shaman, find a way to call your spirit home, right? In terms of spirituality and how I have been trying to recover or make sense of what's my spirituality look like, having grown up in a conservative background as a Pentecostal pastor of daughter of a pastor, I grew up with a lot of rules and dogmas and rules that I was following, but also I was rejecting, I was challenging, but also keeping them and integrating them in my life. So it's complicated, right? When you try to say, well, if I was not a Christian, for example, what does my spirituality look like, right? It's just so complicated to redefine spirituality in that way. So I have been understanding spirituality or aspects of it by integrating aspects of my culture and the things that I do, in setting boundaries, in taking care of myself, in trying to access different mode of consciousness in myself. And among like a lot of things that spirituality can encompass, I think for me, it has meant that I need to develop this profound and proactive intent to heal, right? I think that's part of what has guided my redefinition of what spirituality could mean for me. And that means that I need to assess how patriarchy is still in my practices, in my morality. And so I continue, you know, this journey to decolonize every aspect of my consciousness, trying to bring things from the unconscious too, right? That's very hard, but sometimes you can access that when you find people that can point out towards things that you might need to keep self-actualizing. And, you know, it's just like a whole new process for me being here at PSR, that I have found how big enough it's the epistemology, as Dr. Ish said, about queering things, queering practices, queering the way you live, the way you think, the way you behave, the way you confront the world, right? So it's just a process. I'm in there in that process. So I think for now, my 5 minutes were up.
President David, would like you to share now.
Thank you very much, Amy, for hosting today. Buenas tardes a todos. Feliz Día de la Independencia. So yesterday was Independence Day in Guatemala, where I'm originally from. I want to start out with a word and shout out to Dr. Ish. Congratulations on this very first of the events of the Latinx Roundtable. Delighted to have your leadership in this program, and just so grateful to be able to join with the rest of my colleagues on the faculty here at PSR as we engage in La Reconquista to try to see if we can take back some of the stuff in terms of our communities and their realities in the world. So yesterday was Independence Day in Guatemala. That's just a bit about my own identity, you know. So I spent the day in part talking to my mama, who's in Guatemala, and basically the entire day is dedicated, the entire last couple of weeks, to the celebration of independence in Guatemala, and that begins. The reason that you may or may not know this is that that's the reason why Hispanic Heritage Month is celebrated at this time, is between the 15th of September to October 15, because around this week is when most countries in Latin America celebrate their independence from Spain. I started there because it's an interesting thing to do. Dr. Ish talked about no soy de aquí ni soy de allá, you know, a sense of where do we belong, how do we identify ourselves, whether it is the legacies of what it means to be Latino or Hispanic, you know, whether that's shaped by the legacies of the colonial work presence of Spain throughout Latin America, whether it's a language reality, what is it that creates our identity as individuals. I also think about how much epistemology and engagement it takes to be able to understand ourselves, to develop a self-understanding, and then how that influences the way we think about ourselves and about God. I grew up in Guatemala. I wanted to share a bit of a screenshot here just for fun, as I was sharing with our group as we were gathering, a little bit about, you know, so how am I shaped directly myself? So I'm going to start out here with this first image, which is a picture of my DNA. So this is really what it means to be Latino often. It is this, perhaps we could use, very queer way of being, right? A little pieces of absolutely everything. So whether I identify myself as a mutt, the product of mestizaje, with all the problematic histories and legacies of that term and its use and its misuse, a hybrid individual. So part of it is, I think, what it means to be Latino, it definitely is about, for me, it is about this kind of diversity of ancestors that claim me. Physically, for me, it means that depending on how exposed I am to the sun, different aspects of my identity show up. Different ancestors claim me. If I spend enough time in the sun, then those ancestors from the South will really take over. When I don't, I start looking a lot more like my ancestors that are part of the Jewish community as well, which is another part of my own identity. And so in that way, I'm also a hybrid, and I'm not religiously, as I grew up in a household that was both Christian and Jewish. I think that experience, as well as my experience of identity development, have definitely shaped my understanding of God, my understanding of the world, my understanding of how I think and operate in the world, and what commitments we make. It has shaped, in part, this idea of how we cross boundaries, right? And so I think queer theory has been an incredible seminal work that has helped us to expand in the way that Dr. Alexandra Rosado-Román mentioned, that there's just an expansive epistemology, that queer theory really allows many of us who live in the in-between of various identities to really lean into the work that has been done to think about that epistemology as a way to challenge binaries of identity of any sort, whether they're gender, sexuality, religious identity, and otherwise, and how expansive that experience can be to really enrich rather than challenge ourselves of understanding. As we go into this fall, here at PSR, we're engaging in a number of conversations around issues that matter deeply to our life together as a democracy, as a nation, and in many ways as a world. I think one of those conversations that's really forefront for me is in this series that we're doing with CLGS around queering the vote, is that we really need to engage the conversation about what visions of the society, of the world do we have. There has been an increasing attempt to create boundaries and borders that set limits on the identities of individuals. And so queering is a necessary healing art, as Dr. Alexandra Rosado-Román has mentioned, but also a political art. And the critical thing for us, I'll end with this, is to think about the fact that this is clearly an epistemological move, a theological work, but it's also a political act, to be able to recognize how our communities, this is a picture of my family, that is in many ways represents the kind of vision of the world that many are very anxious about at this moment. And so we need a religious, theological reflection that allows us to view a world where we can truly all thrive. So great to be part of the conversation today.
Thank you, Dr. Ish, Dr. Alexandra, and Reverend David for those remarks. Now I'd like you to invite you to offer some responses to each other and what you heard from your colleague.
I can start here. I was very struck with Dr. Rosado-Román's, remarks about, I consider myself Puerto Rican, but then I came here and suddenly I'm Hispanic. I am one of those people that struggles filling out a census where Hispanic is an ethnicity, but not a race. And the races that are available are white. I mean, obviously many of them, but the ones that I kind of gravitate toward are obvious and similar to, I'm trying to understand, am I white, black, but also indigenous, but it says Native American, so not necessarily Taino, which is the kind of indigenous of the island. That's like according to my ancestry, that's like an 18% of my DNA makeup. So there's, but see, I also don't look at myself in the mirror and say I am indigenous. That's also a category that up here in the States has a completely different connotation than it does on the island. To me, the categorization of Latinidad is a source. I understand how it has become a source of stress. In fact, it was a categorization I actively sought to avoid, considering that it paints in many places in the U.S. a target on our back. Makes it less likely that we might get a job in certain places, or more likely that we'd face social scrutiny or discrimination or prejudice on a regular day-to-day basis. Yet at the same time, after spending enough time in the States, I take pride in my Latinidad, and I connect, to me, being with Latinos, when I run into Dr. Rosado-Román or President Vásquez-Levy on the hallway, and I speak in Spanish for at least 2 or 3 minutes, it's like sitting on a couch for a little bit. It's like that restful moment of like talking to what, and it's the title of the event today, talking to mi people, mi gente, my people, right? The ability to just briefly talk to someone that's my kind of people, my kind of person. So there's something about our Latinidad that still unites us. And I'm not very sure what that is. I wonder if you do know what that is, if there is, you know, because I was thinking, oh, maybe the language, but not really. Many Latinx folks do not speak Spanish anymore. You know, our descendants but do not speak Spanish. Maybe it's, you know, this decolonizing, but we're not the only people who are colonized. So what really distinguishes us and unites us as a Latine people? Where is it? What can we put our finger on this Latinidad? It's almost this like ethereal thing that I can't really fully point out, but it's still at the same time very real for me as someone who's been in the States for a long time. So anyhow, those were my thoughts as Dr. Rosado-Román was speaking, and I agree with Dr. Vásquez-Levy about the political nature of that intersection. And so Latinidad also carries political power, and I wonder, especially as a growing population in the U.S., whether we will have the ability to sway elections, and even within our Latina community, how do we think about you know, promoting inclusivity and political justice even within our communities, considering that LGBTQ plus persons such as myself are often so disenfranchised despite our being a part of the gente, the people. So.
Let me piggyback on a couple of things you mentioned. I also struggle with census. I mean, census are these things that are supposed to count people, demographics and stuff, but also like share resources, right, funds and whatever. But it's also like a very unique way to count and see how whiteness can be threatened by the amount of people or minorities that are growing, you know, and so forth. So I have, you know, sharing something very personal, as I always do. I have been here since 2016. I have been coming and going to Puerto Rico, like literally December and June while I was a student, right? Every time. So I did that because I had a commitment with my community, with my family, everyone that I love. Well, not right now, but at that point, everyone that I love was there in the island. So I always had this refusal of feeling that I was part of the US, because my history with US is complicated in terms of my country. And I always said to people, I live in Puerto Rico, but I study in the US, you know, that denial that I have for a long time. But hearing what Dr. H and President David said, I also struggle, and I have been struggling with inserting myself in this context, the US context, politically. I don't have any trouble, you know, protesting and going back to Puerto Rico and being in touch with whatever is happening, every detail of it, because I care deeply about what's happening in my island. But here, that same refusal of feel that I am here, that I actually live here now, that, you know, it's complicated. I have been, you know, not as much as interested as I am with Puerto Rico. And I think that's a growing edge for me personally, because I do live here now, right? I have commitments here. I have community here. I have people that I appreciate and love that are here. Lots of communities, Latin American communities are here, and I deeply care about that too. So I think that's a growing edge for me. And the other thing that I heard from David that I was like thinking that is also a growing edge for me. What is it that I think about God and how queering my notion of God has allowed me to understand? And for a couple of time now, I don't consider myself a Christian anymore. So as I mentioned earlier, then how do I reflect about God, right? And, you know, sometimes I think that sometimes I do pray like the old days. Sometimes I'm like, oh my God. And then I start talking to God like as I was a Christian, because that's how I related to God like my whole life. And sometimes I try to see God like as a force, as a creativity, as an innovation, as a sustainability, as a strength. as fragility, but also as a violence. You know, I don't want to see or romanticize what God could be. Even when I drum, I'm hitting my hands like crazy, right? So that's a violence. I'm not saying violence as the bad violence. I'm saying like ruptures and that type of energy that breaks patterns and create new ones, you know. So now I'm trying to reflect about God like that, like this universal light and genuineness and creativity that nurtures me, but still it's a working process. Yeah, I think I will stop there.
Yeah, well, I think all of us probably struggle similarly with the census. Maybe that's what makes us all Latinos. We don't know what to check.
Yeah.
I filled the census 4 times. I moved to the U.S. in 1986, so it will be almost 40 years in a couple years here. And so I filled out 4 censuses thus far. And each time I've had to check different boxes as the definition of what it means to be Latino, you know, has shifted from racial to cultural, and then by country, and all these different ways. And I think it is certainly an expression of a nation trying to understand this particular community, and a community trying to identify itself as well. There's a book that many of you may be familiar with, or otherwise I encourage you to take a look at it. It's called The Accidental Asian by Eric Liu. And Eric shares a story in that book that actually I had almost an identical experience. And so I think of myself as the accidental Hispanic. So basically, I was on a college campus for the first time when I first came to the US, and I'm walking around campus during the activity fair at the beginning when you're kind of trying to figure out small, you know, groups you're going to be a part of. And then there's a table with an organization called MASA, the Mexican American Student Association. And they're like, hey, you ought to join MASA. And I'm like, I'm not Mexican. I grew up in Guatemala, which had this kind of mostly hate relationship with Mexico, right? Because of colonial histories as well, all kinds of stuff, the big brother, the little country, right? And so the idea that I would identify as Mexican, I'm like, why would I join a Mexican group, right? And so part of it is this struggle I think we still have, what it means to be Latino. How do we think about these categories? How do we queer an understanding of that isn't easily definable, that is not going to ultimately fit neatly into categories, but that is critically important, right? And the tension, like many things we live with, I think this is part of how I understand it, epistemology of queerness, is that everything is on a spectrum rather than a binary. So the spectrum is between identity and the need to identify ourselves, reclaim our particularity of culture, then also with the need to develop some form of solidarity. Since I started sharing pictures, let me share one more. Dr. Ish made a reference to Native identity. So my DNA is 30% Native Guatemalan and other parts of Native communities in the Americas. But growing up, this would never have been. This is a picture from yesterday. My nephew is the one in the center there dancing, right? As a child growing up in Guatemala, I would not have participated. It was not very common. It was in the middle of a civil war where the nation was trying to really fight against the native communities of Guatemala that make up 55% of the population of the country. And most of us have significant elements of native identity, but many of us were forced during a period of conflict to shy away from that identity, as you just described it, right? Like it would reduce opportunities for work and be viewed. So the fact that my nieces and nephews are growing up with a very different experience, right, of what it means to claim that native identity within communities that are not only fully native, but also more mixed. So the question is, how do we both celebrate the particularity of our identities, religious, gender, sexuality, but also understand what Dean Susan Abraham at PSR calls the limits of identity politics, and then move towards that solidarity? How does, for example, the state of California, that is 40% Latino, and in 18 and under is 52% Latino, how does that group of individuals reshape and claim their rightful rights within a state and its wealth and its positionality, right? And that requires that we find ways to celebrate individuality and particular identities, but also find ways to create solidarity. I think that, again, the work of queer theorists, the understanding we have done about identity in terms of LGBTQ identity is invaluable to be able to combine and understand how we create solidarities.
Thank you all for those amazing remarks and that vantage point into Latin identity. We're going to now move to the Q&A portion of today's conversation. Y'all have been shy on the chat. So I would just invite you to unmute yourself and maybe show your face. You don't have to if you don't want to ask our panelists questions.
I think we do have one question on the chat.
Okay, I have a.
It was from you, so go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening. It's great to be here. As a person who identifies as second generation Puerto Rican, born in Pennsylvania, in Dutch country. So I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So I really call myself a Dutch-Rican as an identity. And so I have family that have served in the military, which is both in Puerto Rico and in the United States, here in the mainland, and also other colleagues, and really exploring this whole thing of 200%ers, people who identify 100% as U.S. citizens, but also identify 100% as Latinx. So these I think these are important moments, particularly when the multi-ethnicity of a person's identity is being even more important. If you look at what the census will look like in 2030, they won't ask you anymore about whether you're Hispanic, or they're going to ask you specific, like Puerto Rican, Mexican, which is, so it says something about where we are. But I just wonder what this conversation might be like from that perspective.
Yeah, I think.
A great point.
Yeah.
Presidente.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's really critical, right? I think part of, the success, so to speak, of being able to claim identity on a rightful part of the heritage of a community becomes equated with assimilation of that community, and eventually then the particularity of that identity may become less significant in some ways. But I think part of it is charting a new way. We just have never been in this place as a nation, right? In which we have this level of demographic shift happening all at once. But the forces are in place to try to diminish power for communities, right? The colonial project was about creating taxonomies of race, of gender, and then associating hierarchies of power to that. And so I think, again, queer work, theory and practice, mestizaje, other ways in which Latino communities have sought to do this, is to challenge that assignation of power and those taxonomies with it, right? And again, it's difficult because while we are at the same time trying to gain and establish position and power, but I do think the conversation will change. Perhaps our own theological work within the church and the Christian tradition might help us as we think about how both the Christian traditions and others have wrestled with the ideas of Jesus as being both fully human and fully divine. What does that mean, right? And among us here, and depending on the religious part of the Christian tradition, if you're a part of that you come from, the answer to that is multiple, right? We try to wrestle with this idea that Jesus can, whose work of redemption is about taking down walls, it's about uniting, it's around challenging gender and race and sexuality and other things, right? In the way that Paul writes about his work, or the redemptive work of Jesus. So yeah, what does it mean to be fully human and fully divine? Not going to argue which part is the divine part of the Latino or the Puerto Rican and U.S. identity.
Yeah, I think some of the original mestizaje theologies kind of talk about Jesus precisely as a mestizo himself. Lydia, Dr. Lydia, your question made me think that sometimes we get so involved in the act of queering. We got to deconstruct these binary, we got to challenge that sometimes queerness can seem to be very esoteric and very up there, like let's get rid of these boundaries, let's get rid of these things. But we also forget sometimes I think our queer project also has to be grounded in a material reality, which is that but also your ancestors, your family members moved to the US for a very real material reason. When I went to, this is my first job in academia as an assistant professor. I had a previous job before, but before that, I was a high school teacher for 11 years. And when I would visit Puerto Rico and I would talk to my cousins who were teachers, and they would tell me how much money they made and they make on the island. And then they asked me how much money I made. I refused to answer because it was more than 5 times what they made. And there's a reason that I'm here. I escaped, conversion therapy, oppression for being queer. And so can I really fully say, well, I'm Puerto Rican and I'm trying to decolonize and I'm trying to fight against this US identity? I'm here. I'm claiming my identity. I'm not in Puerto Rico protesting toward independence, fully right now. I am very much making use of my, what I will call, privilege of being able to easily migrate into a safer community, as is the Bay Area. So, and I have to contend with that reality and remind myself that the process of queering and of decolonizing also must be grounded in the reality that we have a necessity to survive. And that's why when you talk about the 200%ers, I look at that population and I see probably, like as President David is saying, like there is a future here that is much less divided and much more united. And I originally did challenge this theologian who come up with mestizaje theology. Virgilio Elizondo comes up with the mestizaje theology, right? And he talks about that the future is mestizo, right? Is this eschatological vision? Like this is where we're headed, and it's almost like, and I can see that happening realistically. Do I necessarily want it always to happen? Not necessarily. I would also want to preserve some of the indigenous components of my DNA and culture, but it's this delicate dance that we're going to continue to do. I don't have I don't have any more insight other than this is going to be a messy journey forward, and I'm living for it. I wanna make sure that our Latinidad becomes as big and as all-encompassing as it can.
I have a sense. Sorry. Can I?
Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah, we've got 2 more questions in the chat, so
yeah, very, very quickly. I was sharing with my peers. I think it was at the retreat, the faculty retreat we had before the semester started. And I was sharing that there is this book, Jim Wallace's book, America's Original Sin. And in that book, there's statistics of how white people will be minority, like I don't remember which year, like very, very soon, right? So that's to say that those categories are very problematic because it's not only recollecting information just to say, oh, there's Puerto Ricans, there's Mexicans, which that's also part of it. It is the good side of it, but the other side, it's also, there's already statistics of how white people will be minority and how problematic that will be and what will be the consequences of white people being minority in the US or blah, 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 whatever. And the other thing that I wanted to say, well, Latine, it's only defined as a diverse group of people who have Latin roots. That's a very general, big definition. I personally have encountered 2 types. I don't want to do the binary, but that's the only thing I could come right now with 2 types of people. I know there's a lot of people in between, but this is just to signal, like try to address your question about the 200% and the conversation. How will that look like? I know people who for example, have a friend who grew up, who was born in Chicago, but she's from Puerto Rican descent, and she's very much involved here in the US as she's involved in Puerto Rico with culture, with politics. She's in both places, things that I aspire to do someday. She's like very integrated to both. She's proud of being from Chicago. She's proud of being from Puerto Rican. She learned her history from Puerto Rico. She combines the Chicago identity with the Puerto Rican. Well, she does it all, right? That's like a one type of person that will be that 200% because it's 100% Chicago, 100% Puerto Rican. That's the bomb, right? But I have also encountered here in the academia people, usually white passing Latinos, male Latinos, in my experience, what I have seen, that only use their Latinidad as a token for fellowships. You know, I am only Latino if there's like 25 grants for me to access in this or that organization. And that's also problematic because I'm not saying that they are not Latino enough to claim whatever, but their research, their mode of being reflect they are not invested in whatever the community needs. Their researches are like in about all field about two white people, you know, and I'm not saying you cannot do that either. I'm just stating that there's people who only claim Latinidad when it's convenient, and they are not, when it's not convenient, there's life as regular because they are just a white passing Latino people. That's just what I have seen in my experience so far.
Thank you for that insight. I'm going to ask that you, Dr. Alexandra, answer this question first, and then we have two more in the chat. They're coming. So this one is from Carlos. I have this issue with Latino and Hispanic terms. It seems like both refer to language and geography. Also, both terms sound like imposed characteristics because they are related to the history of colonization. Are we Latinos because our colonization, or because it is a way to differentiate that North America is better than Central and South America?
You're muted, Doctora.
We're saying that that's a very difficult, loaded question. I will try to unpack what I can have from it. I don't think non-person is, any person it's a Latino because one thing. I don't think Latino and Latina and Latinx communities are a multiplicity of things and can be defined. And that's why I mentioned the Latine definition is so broad, but also at the same time, you can create your own sense of identity within that. We definitely have a history of colonization. And well, from my experience in Puerto Rico being still a colonized territory, I don't think we have overcome that phase of avoiding to talk about colonization because we are beyond that. We are definitely beyond colonization, right? But we have been colonized more than 500 years now. That's mostly what we have experienced. We have history, we have text that talks about our indigenous people and, you know, and the history of slavery and how enslaved people came here. I mean, were brought here by force and and definitely colonization has shaped our conversations because it has definitely impacted our sense of identity, sense of self. How do we think about God? How do we engage in intro and inter solidarity with our fellow islands like Dominican Republic or Haiti or Cuba, you know, and the rest of them? It definitely has take a toll, a big toll in how we think, we are creative or not creative enough, how it has taken a toll in our imagination, in how we speak about God and everything. So it's difficult for me to say what is a Latino and what isn't a Latino, but I can definitely say that we are more than colonization, even though colonization, we are trying to decolonize, and even the sovereign countries, right? The ones that are, you know, experiencing their celebration, like Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, that are celebrating their independence. We haven't, so that's not something we can claim yet. And even them, they are dealing with decoloniality as well, because colonization is not something you can remove when you be in a sovereign country. I guess my peers can try to answer more.
Actually, I think I don't have anything to add to that. I thought that was really well said.
Yeah, the only very quick note I would say is about the limitations of terms. And I think, to Carlos' question, like really we do, I think every term is unstable and limited, and it will continue to evolve. And I think it demonstrates the legacies of what has brought it about. What's important to me is identifying ways of solidarity, right? So, because otherwise we can be atomized. Right? If we don't identify in some ways as a collective of some sort, even with whatever limitations we might put on it, then the ability to create solidarities is difficult. And that maybe while I'm on that, just really quick, because there was a question about queering the vote and how this connects. I mean, I think that has to do with the way to queer the vote is to recognize that, for example, within religious communities, many denominational, particular Christian denominations are splitting over a divide that oftentimes feels like they either have to choose to be gay or to be with people of color, right? So that's, the choice, right? If you think about the votes that have taken place within the United Methodist Church, within many other traditions, there's this perception that you have to choose one or the other. That's a false choice. Right, it's a choice that if you look at social movements in the United States, most of them are led by people who are both LGBTQ and people of color, right? That's really not so part of that queering the vote is about recognizing that we are being pitted against each other, which is a common understanding about how power is created by pitting people against each other. So queering the vote is about seeing alliances, recognizing the multiplicity of our identities, speaking in complex ways about what it means to be both LGBTQ and a person of color for folks who hold both identities, rather than it's one group or the other.
Thank you. Dr. Ish, Dr. Alexandra, do you have anything to add to how does queering the vote present itself in your concentric circles of communities you're a part of?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about I want to talk a little bit briefly about the queer epistemology component of this all, right? If I were to say that I'm gay, I am saying that I am invoking a very stable category. I am a man who likes men, right? People tend to associate gay with that. Some women who like women use the word gay as well. Okay, but the idea here is that there's this universal category that everyone seems to more or less understand. It's an invocation toward a label and an identity. But when I say that I'm queer, the word queer originally meant weird. So it's almost this anti-normative identity. It's saying I'm not like you, and that's okay. It means that I don't have to fit in these boxes, right? And so queerness as an epistemological project is looking at norms. And the way I understand it is looking at norms at the knowledge that sustains them and is challenging those. It is destabilizing the norms that we tend to hold dear and hold on to, especially if they're oppressive, by making their ground shake. And these norms stand on knowledge. And by knowledge, I mean quote unquote knowledge. Okay. For example, we know that this is back several decades ago, 6-7 decades ago, that homosexuality is some sort of mental disorder. So we know that these people need help, that we know that, okay, this is quote unquote knowledge. Even scientific observations pass through culture and generate cultural meaning. And so the idea behind queerness is this idea that we're going to start looking at the underlying knowledge that informs our norms and our rules. So for me, queering the vote is more than just railing against laws, railing against policy, but rather examining the underlying norms and customs that inform those policies. And whenever those norms and customs are oppressive or generate oppression, then we attack those at a normative level. This means that we foster education. It means that, Dr. Rosado-Román, that we foster what you like to call artivism, expression and creativity. We're going to live into a new norm. How do you challenge a norm? Because you can change laws and still have racism. You can change laws and still have homophobia. So how do you challenge those norms that permeate society and continue to perpetuate oppression? Well, you have to have a culture of encounter, and you have to have a culture of people who are willing to live outside the norm, create a new reality by living into it. Okay. And to me, that's what queering the vote means. It means that part of our voting and our political activism is focused on rules and laws and politicians, people themselves, but there's also an underlying evaluation of the norms and the customs and the principles that we hold dear that fuel our vote. And to me, that's how I see it.
All right, we're going to move on to the big question from Dr. Bernie. In your views, do you want to?
Yeah, it may be a question for another day. Having hung out often in Catholic circles, I'm thinking back the past 10, 20 years and worked in the Catholic Church for many decades. I long heard people say with a sigh of relief, well, Latinos will save the Catholic Church in the United States because white people have stopped going and they're having, that's the hope, right? And yet, in thinking in terms of political power, I would guess that 90% of bishops in the United States, maybe not that many, but are Irish American, right? So that hold on power, even though I'm mostly Irish American myself, 70% of us don't, go into a church building, maybe other than baptism and our funerals or whatever. But so that's a messy question because I think in many other areas, right, when you have new groups of people coming into a community or set of communities, how does it shift understandings, in this case, of Christianity, of Christian community? And so that's a really big question, but if anyone has a reflection on it.
Yeah. I mean, I'll take an initial stab. I think each of us can speak to it a little differently because I would say there are lots of ways in which every migration group reshapes, all aspects of a society, including its religious norms and approaches. The most obvious ones are, as you described, right, the sense of just the sheer numbers of people. Migration has historically made the United States more Christian, even though the perceptions in the political sphere is that somehow migrants are a threat to the Christian identity of the nation. The reality is that the percentage of immigrants coming into the United States who identify as Christian and practice Christian traditions, not just Latino but others, is higher Christian than the U.S. population, and that has been shifted a while back in terms of so basically migration makes the country more Christian, and it's part of the reason why the United States, the sort of prevalence of Christianity within the United States has remained significant. So the question is, in what ways will it change it, right? And I think some of that will yet be determined. The ways that it's perceived is, it will become more conservative. It will be viewed, whether it's around abortion or in other ways, right? That's a perception, or less welcoming of LGBTQ people. I think that's a simplistic understanding of the perception, in part because a lot of the practices and participation of Latinos and religious communities that are not sort of fit the stereotypes that public opinion is paying attention to, don't get paid attention to, are ignored. They're not as visible. So I would highlight two different ways. There's many more. These are certainly the ways that I hope in our work at PSR that we might be able to partner with an increasing number of Latino communities in reshaping our understanding of church and its future. And the two have to do with innovation, and the second one with challenging progressive institutions. So in terms of innovation, Latino religious communities, particularly, if you think about from Guatemala, many of the immigrants are evangelical Christians who are very independent, very entrepreneurial. They're just starting new ministries. And so I think there's just we need to pay attention to how they're making it go. The kind of agency that immigrant communities find in religious spaces, right? The guy who's the dishwasher on Thursday is a pastor on Sunday, right? These are the communities where people exercise agency and participation in the society and the community. So we need to pay attention to that because that is reshaping the church. The second one is, I think that, the most diverse churches I've ever been to are Latino communities. And I mean racially diverse, like massively racially diverse, right? Unlike most English-speaking congregations that tend to be fairly, homogeneous. Evangelical churches are more diverse in terms of ethnicity than progressive churches. So I think Latino communities in particular, but other immigrant communities, are holding a mirror against most of our progressive churches for the ways that we have created very inclusive theologies, but really terrible practices that really do not create welcome spaces that invite people into what we pretend to be neutralized, beautiful, neutral spaces where everybody gets along, nobody holds on to anything. But that kind of austere space is not appealing to many communities, and so they actually don't feel welcome. The creation of white space in progressive Christian spaces is dominant, right? Like the way to belong is to become nothing, to blend into some blah reality of the comment that was made by Ms. Dan, right? Being all-American means that ultimately you just become white. So I think another impact of the Latinos in the society will be to hold a mirror to progressive movements to say, really?
I'm gonna tackle the question very, very briefly because we're running out of time, and I'm also gonna try to catch Miss Ann's question about the notion of salvation and in what way it's understood, because that's where I was going with the question. I mean, the theologian here is gonna think eschatologically. My favorite Latinx queer theorist is Jose Esteban Munoz. He introduces three important concepts to our understanding of the intersection of brownness and queerness, and that is disidentification, a sense of brown, and the concept of utopia. If I were to summarize his three books into a few sentences, it'd be this idea that the oppression that Latinx people experience and brown people experience, this ni de aquí ni de allá, neither here nor there, causes a sense of disidentification. It forces us to retreat from society. It's almost like we're in society, but we're not really in society. And we create our own communities. That's what happens when you, for example, go to a gay bar and it's like a sacred space, and there's a drag queen speaking a particular language. So this is a form of disidentification. We're in society, we're doing things that people tend to do, but we're kind of doing it in our own way. We disidentify. It's a political quest to survive. In that space, we generate a sense of solidarity, which he calls a sense of brown. Okay, I look at my fellow disidentified people and we band together. But there's something else that happens with the sense of brown, is that we somehow, especially even if subconsciously, start imagining what a future would look like. That is what he calls utopia. If I were to baptize them, then I would call that kingdom of God, eschatological vision, right? And I think that subconsciously, think about immigration, think about our culture. Subconsciously, we have this idea of what this world should look like. And I think that in the context of a Christian church with language such as the kingdom of God, salvation, it allows us to actually concretize what that vision looks like. And that's, I think, one of the greatest contributions, also in epistemology, a way of looking at this world in terms of where it should lead, it should head. I think that's one of the greatest contributions that queer and Latinx people can offer a Christian community, is that vision of what the world should look like, which is largely informed by our own oppression and our own desire to survive.
Thank you.
And so we have about 7 more minutes. Are there any other last questions? Okay. So I guess I will ask a question. How do you connect with your heritage and your queerness? Is there like exclusion that happens because of that? Or is there a way to do that and really embrace family as part of being queer?
Well, I think I can start and my peers can follow. And also I am very forgetful these days. So it's how can you talk about integrated culture and queerness? Okay, good. In my case, that has been only reflected through bomba, which is our oldest Afro-Puerto Rican dancing and music. I started to connect with bomba because I felt that I needed to experience a different type of rhythm within my body. I needed to heal my body. I needed to move my body in different ways that were too secular or del mundo for my parents or my community. I needed to connect with bomba has a lot of rhythms, and most of them, which is with the drum, they are beating like if your heart were pulsing, right? So it's a way to connect my entire body, my circulation, my literally with whatever I'm feeling in the moment. And also because I see the queering part in bomba, and I have shared that with Dr. Ich. It's a very patriarchal tradition too, when only the males were the one that could play the drum. Female can only sing and dance, but the drum that follows the main pattern, and the drum who interprets the dancer's movements to create a rhythm, only were played by males. And that was a taboo like until like 20 years ago, maybe, when the first queer women dare to play in public, and when the first queer men dare to dance with falda, which was only used by the women, right? And also because whatever we are doing in bomba, the dancer is the one that is creating new patterns and new rhythms with their movement of their body, right? The main drummer is there to interpret, to improvise when there's no one in the bate, the center in which we dance. But when there's a dancer, the dancer is the one saying to the main drummer, this is what you're going to sound like. This is the movement that you're going to interpret. Whatever the sound is, how do you say that? Regardless of how the main drummer interprets the movement of the dancer, it's the dancer who is putting forward that movement for that person to interpret. So it has been a part of our cultural identity that still to this day, there's Puerto Ricans who don't know nothing about bomba. And they do about plena, which is the youngest Afro-Puerto Rican rhythm, because it has been whitened more, and it has been played by more people, like in Christmas, only festivities and whatever. But bomba, which is like a very communal, everyday practice, familiar practice, it's something that a lot of Puerto Rican people don't know. And I think that's one way for us Puerto Rican to put our heritage there, cultural backgrounds there, but also acknowledge how queer it is. You know, the rules are subverted. Everything that you think you're expecting is the other way, because whatever I want to say is the sound that is going to be played, you know? So you don't have that control over what's happening. And I think that's beautiful. And that's the way I have encountered a little bit of healing, and the way I have connected also a piece of a sense of spirituality when I try to assess how that informs my perception of my body, my spirit, and my whole self.
Beautiful. Yeah, I wanted to, just maybe go to the question that was raised by Dr. Munoz about, the relationship between sort of second, third generation, reconnecting back to first generation. My first name is Jose, and so I've often been really attracted to the story of Joseph in the Bible, the longest sort of novella in the Hebrew text. And many of you may be familiar with it. So the story is about these siblings, right? And there's a improper division of resources. Basically, one's favored over the others leads to disruption and then displacement and migration. So it's a story about migration in many ways, and lots of things can be read into it. But at the end of the story, when Joseph has settled into a new land, he has assimilated as much as anyone could possibly assimilate. He's married an Egyptian woman. His children have Egyptian names. He has assimilated so much, his brothers don't recognize him when they come to reconnect with him. They don't even recognize him. He's assimilated so much. But the first question out of his mouth is my father still alive? So that's a haunting image for me, is the sense that no matter how far you assimilate and become a part of it, if you give up that identity, which is what many people have been forced to do in whiteness, in the creation of whiteness in the United States, is in the melting pot, you have to shed all of that. And of course, some cannot do that, right? Or are not allowed to do that. And so are held suspicious by the society because their skin tone doesn't allow them to really blend in that way into this melting pot. So, but the power of that story is that call. And I think that this is a need for every immigrant community to figure out how to connect its past with its future, right? How to reclaim elements of where we come from, but also to succeed within a new community into which we come. And I think that is a critical practice that is required of the whole church today, of many of our social structures and societal norms, is to figure out a way, what of our traditions, of our sacred histories, do we take into this new future? To pretend that we can just assimilate into a new world without that legacy is problematic. The challenge, I think, is going to be that for many second, third generation, identity in many immigrant communities tends to be packaged as a single thing. We see that a lot in our Pacific Islander students as they think about the work they're doing with immigrant communities in congregations here, right? So what happens is that the congregation is this package of culture, language, identity, and everything. And so whenever an individual, a young person, begins to challenge any part of that package, you know, whether it's developing a more progressive understanding of sacred text or of sexuality, then they feel that they have to abandon the whole thing, right? Like they have to merge completely, and they're often forced by the religious communities actually to make that choice. So I think the work before us is that work of reconciling our past with our future, right? And to model that many communities are doing that well, families are doing that well. It is an exercise of migration in a new way that I think can really shape a way for the future, as we as a nation certainly wrestle with deeply problematic legacies of the nation, and yet try to aspire to a hopeful future of this nation together.
Thank you so much for all of your comments. Appreciate our roundtable so much for their wisdom. I'm going to turn it over to Ish now. He has some things he'd like to say.
Awesome. I love how our conversation left on a little bit of a cliffhanger about bomba, and there was an additional cliffhanger about the family, because I want to share a little bit about the rest of our programming for Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm sharing my screen here with our flyers. This is our Hispanic Heritage Month programming. Today was on September 16th with our Mi Gente event. But on October 1st, we have theologians M.P. Davila and Natalia Imperatori Lee leading us on a conversation about familia and the queerness, and queering the concept of familia. Precisely that idea that no matter where you go, this idea of family is central and so important to our Latinx culture, whether it be biological or chosen. And so that's where our conversation is going to head. On October 15th, we have an event called Si Se Puede, about activism, and our presenter is Lisbeth Melendez. She used to work for the Human Rights Campaign and did work with their faith activism department, and has extensive experience on grassroots Latinx queer organizing. So while the October 1st event is going to be certainly more academic and perhaps more of a reflection on La Familia, October 15th is going to be much more about activism. With that, we will wrap our Hispanic Heritage Month. We will have another event. Here are each one of these events. We will have another event that's going to be a book club, not an event. We're going to read Queer God de Amor during the month of November. We have November 5th and November 12th, our first two meetings, and then our third meeting will be on November 19th, and that one will feature the author of the book, Queer God de Amor, Miguel Diaz. We will be providing copies of the book to anyone who either doesn't have one or needs help acquiring one. More information will be forthcoming on how you can order that. And finally, I do not have the flyer ready just yet because we're still putting the event together. We will be having a live event at PSR that will also be on Zoom, but it is a bomba event featuring Dr. Alexandra Rosado-Román's group, Bate y Tambo, who are going to do a presentation, and it'll be with an accompanying political and spiritual reflection. Those are the events for the fall. That's going to be on December 3rd at 6:30 p.m. I said 6:30 or 6 p.m. 6:30. 6? 6:30 p.m. At the Bade Museum in the Pacific School of Religion, but we will also be live streaming it on Zoom. For those of you who are not connected, I mean, if you're here, you're probably already connected with our Facebook group. We have a Facebook and an Instagram, so please make sure that you're following us so that you can keep up with all of our events. I am putting our Facebook link on the chat, so if you don't yet follow our Facebook, please do so. And if you scroll down, we also posted our Instagram page. So if you're an Instagram person, we just launched the Instagram. Facebook's been around for a little bit. Finally, I cannot dismiss or leave today without my heartfelt thanks to our incredible moderator, Amy Toby. Thank you so much for facilitating this conversation with so much skill and so much grace. I'm honestly, when I heard that you were joining our Latinx Roundtable, I was overjoyed, and working with you has been an incredible honor and privilege. Thank you for everything you have done for our team and to help us build community. With that, on behalf of the Latinx Roundtable and the Center for the LGBTQ+ and Gender Studies in Religion, we thank all of you for attending tonight, and we look forward to many more conversations. Bernie, do you have anything else to say?
No, just thank you for being here, and check out the website, clgs.org, for other events, and happy Hispanic Heritage Month.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our moderator. Thank you, Bernie, and thank you all for attending. We will see you soon. Buenas noches.
Thanks, everybody. And whenever you stop the recording, because I want to share a quick clip here for everybody, from Selena, the movie, about this whole discussion of multiple identities.
Sounds good.